The year is 1945. The air, thick with the stench of salt and spent gunpowder, hung heavy over the jagged coral of Okinawa. Beneath the relentless sun, a young Japanese woman, scarcely more than a girl, pressed herself into the damp earth of a cave, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, other women and children, their faces streaked with grime and terror, huddled in the stifling darkness. Distant, percussive thunder vibrated through the rock, the ceaseless drumbeat of American artillery. This was not the war of headlines or distant battlefields. This was the intimate, terrifying war of survival, where every shadow held a potential threat and every unfamiliar sound heralded doom. For weeks, the women of Okinawa had lived with a constant expectation of brutality, a chilling narrative woven by their own government. The Pacific War, a conflict of unprecedented ferocity, had carved a path of unimaginable destruction across islands few in the West had ever heard of. From the malarial jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, the Japanese Imperial Army had fought with a fanatical zeal, often to the last man. This unyielding resistance, born of the Bushido Code, a warrior's path that valued death over surrender, was profoundly misunderstood by an American public reeling from Pearl Harbor. On the Japanese home front, and in the territories they fiercely defended, propaganda machines worked tirelessly, painting the invading Americans as monstrous, vengeful demons, bayonet-wielding barbarians who would rape, torture, and slaughter any who fell into their hands. Children were taught to fear the gaijin more than death itself. Women were explicitly instructed to commit suicide rather than endure capture and the supposed unspeakable atrocities that would follow. The horror stories were vivid, pervasive, and deeply ingrained, especially amongst the civilian populations caught in the path of the relentless American advance. For these women and children, the very sight of an American soldier was synonymous with the end of all hope, the confirmation of every terrifying rumor. Yet, as the American war machine rolled inexorably closer to the Japanese homeland, a different, quieter drama began to unfold in the shattered villages and subterranean shelters. The soldiers of the United States Marine Corps and Army, hardened by years of brutal combat, were indeed a formidable force. But their mission, unlike that of the Imperial Army, extended beyond mere conquest. They were tasked not only with defeating the enemy but also, often to their own surprise, with managing and eventually assisting the terrified civilian populations they encountered. The expectation of the Japanese women, nurtured by years of state-sponsored fear, was a terrifying certainty of violence, degradation, and death. They anticipated brutal retribution, mirroring the ruthlessness their own forces had often displayed towards conquered populations. They envisioned a fate worse than any nightmare, a final, horrifying chapter to their besieged lives. What they actually encountered, however, was a jarring, bewildering, and ultimately transformative contradiction. Not the savagery of beasts, but the hesitant, often awkward, and sometimes profoundly human gestures of men who, despite the uniforms and the rifles, shared a common humanity. Private First Class Thomas "Tommy" Henderson, a young man barely out of his teens from a small Iowa town, remembered the scene vividly. His unit, having secured a ridge overlooking a bombed-out village, was cautiously clearing a series of caves that dotted the landscape. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential ambush. Then, from the deepest recesses of one cave, came a low whimpering. Tommy, rifle at the ready, crept forward, his heart pounding. What he expected was a desperate, fanatical soldier, perhaps rigged with explosives, ready for a final, suicidal charge. What he found instead were a dozen pairs of wide, terrified eyes staring back from the darkness. Women and children, thin and weak, their faces etched with a fear so profound it transcended language. Their bodies trembled, not with defiance, but with sheer, unadulterated terror. The propaganda had worked its insidious magic, twisting the image of the enemy into something inhuman. But standing there, in the oppressive silence of that cave, Tommy Henderson saw only fellow human beings, utterly helpless, utterly petrified. He lowered his rifle, slowly, carefully, his hands moving to unclip something from his belt. It was a can of peaches, sticky with syrup, a small piece of home in a world consumed by war. He extended it, offering it not as a weapon, but as an olive branch, a glimmer of unexpected kindness. The gesture, simple yet profound, was the first crack in the wall of terror, the initial tremor of a tectonic shift in understanding. The sweet, syrupy fruit, a symbol of American abundance and generosity, began its quiet work, offering not just sustenance, but a fragile, nascent hope. The tentative offer of the peaches, a small, vibrant splash of color in the monochrome landscape of war, hung in the air. For a long moment, the women and children remained frozen, their eyes darting between the strange metal can and the uniformed hand that offered it. This was not the fire, the steel, the brutality they had been promised. This was an offering. Slowly, painstakingly, a young mother, her infant clutched tightly to her breast, reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal, then grasped it. The tiny click of the can opening, followed by the faint, sweet scent of fruit, was a sound utterly alien to the cacophony of war that had dominated their lives. This small act, repeated in countless caves and bunkers across the embattled islands, began to chip away at the formidable edifice of propaganda that had defined their world. Official military policy, though often overlooked in the chaos of battle, did indeed mandate humane treatment of enemy civilians. Instructions from command emphasized that Japanese non-combatants, particularly women and children, were not to be harmed and, where possible, were to be offered medical attention and food. While the primary objective was always the swift and decisive defeat of the imperial forces, there was an underlying strategic and moral imperative to distinguish between the military enemy and the civilian population. Photographs and reports from the front lines, often initially met with skepticism by an American public fed its own brand of wartime dehumanization, slowly began to filter back, showing American GIs sharing rations, tending to the wounded, and even playing with Japanese children. These were not acts of pure altruism alone. They were also a calculated effort to undermine Japanese morale, to show that the monsters they were fighting were, in fact, capable of compassion. Yet, for the soldiers themselves, often exhausted, traumatized, and wary, these gestures frequently stemmed from a more primal human instinct, the recognition of shared vulnerability, a fleeting glimpse of peace amidst the inferno. The initial encounters were rarely smooth. Language barriers were immense, overcome only by gestures, patience, and the universal language of need. Soldiers would approach with hands open, rifles slung, often repeating the Japanese word for food, tabamono, or gesturing towards the nearest aid station. The terror in the eyes of the Japanese women was a palpable force, a wall of fear that had to be patiently dismantled. They would shrink from touch, flinch at sudden movements, and often tried to communicate through desperate pleas or silent, pleading stares. Many had witnessed unspeakable horrors, both at the hands of their own retreating military, who sometimes executed civilians suspected of collaboration or simply to prevent them from becoming a burden, and from the relentless American bombardments that had obliterated their homes and shattered their families. Their fear was rational, deeply rooted in the harsh realities of their experience. The sight of a towering American soldier, helmeted and armed, with unfamiliar features and booming voices, was a terrifying apparition straight from their darkest nightmares. But the peaches, the K-ration chocolate, the sweet crackers, these simple offerings began to bridge the chasm. The clatter of an American mess kit, the offer of a warm blanket, the sight of a corpsman gently bandaging a child's wound. These small acts of unexpected kindness chipped away at the monstrous image. The women, who had braced themselves for rape and murder, instead found themselves receiving medical care, clean water, and food. The transformation was agonizingly slow, a glacial shift in perception measured in hesitant glances and cautious acceptance. It wasn't immediate trust, but rather a profound bewilderment, a re-evaluation of everything they had been taught. The Americans were not devils. They were men. Men who, despite the war, still possessed a fundamental, unsettling humanity. The recurring image of the canned peaches, their syrupy sweetness a stark contrast to the bitter taste of war, became a silent testament to this unexpected reality. It was a tangible piece of the foreign, enemy world that was not designed to harm, but to nourish. A child, too young to understand the complexities of geopolitics or military strategy, understood the comfort of a full stomach. A mother, exhausted and despairing, understood the desperate hope offered by medicine for her feverish child. These small, individual moments, accumulating across battlefields and refugee camps, formed a powerful counter-narrative to the one that had held them captive. The peaches were more than just food. They were a fleeting moment of peace, a promise whispered across enemy lines that perhaps, just perhaps, not all hope was lost. They were democracy's unexpected bounty, manifesting not in grand declarations, but in humble, sugary succor. This emerging reality was bewildering, forcing these women to reconcile the terrifying propaganda with the undeniable, tangible evidence of unexpected compassion. Their world was not merely being defeated, it was being rewritten one gentle gesture at a time. The initial paralyzing terror began to recede, replaced by a nascent, fragile curiosity, a desperate need to understand this new, bewildering enemy. The transformation was not uniform, nor was it without its moments of regression. There were still soldiers who saw only the enemy, still civilians whose terror was too deep-seated to be easily assuaged. But the tide of individual encounters slowly, inexorably, began to turn. As more and more Japanese civilians, initially coaxed from their hiding places by patient GIs and the promise of food and safety, reached the burgeoning American-run refugee camps, the stark contrast between expectation and reality became undeniable. These camps, hastily constructed but often remarkably organized, offered a semblance of order and security amidst the devastation. Food, clothing, and rudimentary medical facilities, often staffed by American doctors and nurses whose primary mission was humanitarian aid, became symbols of a different kind of power, one that sustained life rather than merely destroying it. The daily rituals within these camps further solidified the new perception. Morning rations, distributed without fanfare, included staples like rice, often supplemented by those familiar canned goods, peaches, fruit cocktail, occasionally even corned beef hash. For people who had been subsisting on roots and scavenged scraps, these provisions were nothing short of miraculous. The sheer volume of supplies, the seemingly endless stream of trucks bringing food and medicine, spoke volumes. It was an abundance that underscored a fundamental difference in the nature of the warring nations. Japan, a resource-scarce island nation, had waged a war of desperate expansion, fueled by imperial ambition and a dire need for raw materials. America, by contrast, was a titan of industry and agriculture, capable of projecting immense military might while simultaneously sustaining its own vast population and, unexpectedly, extending its resources to those it had just conquered. The peaches, then, were not just a taste of sweetness. They were a taste of a different world, one where fundamental needs could be met, where scarcity was not the defining condition of existence. They were a quiet, sugary testament to the industrial might and democratic ideals that valued the well-being of its people, and by extension, often extended a surprising degree of care to the defeated. Stories, initially whispered with disbelief, began to spread through the camps. Tales of American doctors saving children from diphtheria, of GIs sharing their cigarettes and candy, of military police directing traffic and protecting families from looters. These anecdotes, repeated and embellished, became a powerful oral history, directly challenging the state-sponsored propaganda that had demonized the invaders. The women who had once contemplated suicide rather than face American soldiers now sought them out for medical aid, for information, for a moment of quiet reassurance. This shift was not merely an acceptance of defeat, it was a profound psychological reorientation, a re-evaluation of the very concept of enemy. The Americans were still the conquerors, undeniably, but they were also, unexpectedly, providers and protectors. This transformation was not just about the provision of material comforts, it was about the restoration of dignity. The Japanese women, who had been stripped of agency and told their fate was sealed, found themselves treated with a surprising degree of respect. While undoubtedly occupying forces, the American military often facilitated efforts to establish local governance, to repatriate displaced persons, and to begin the monumental task of rebuilding. These women, once passive victims of war, gradually found their voices, their roles in the burgeoning post-war society. The encounters, which began in terror, evolved into a complex relationship built on necessity, observation, and a gradual, almost reluctant, respect. The symbolism of the peaches deepened, becoming not just a sign of immediate relief, but a representation of the broader principles that would, in time, help rebuild a shattered nation. They embodied the promise of stability, the quiet reassurance of sustained effort, and the stark contrast to the privations and rigid ideology that had brought their nation to ruin. The meticulous efforts of the American occupation forces to establish civilian control zones and provide humanitarian aid were well documented, even amidst the ongoing combat. Beyond the initial harrowing encounters, formal civilian internment camps were established, such as those on Okinawa, which housed tens of thousands of displaced Japanese. Here, the provision of food, shelter, and medical services became systematized. Medical units, previously engaged solely in treating combat casualties, diverted significant resources to civilian health. Records from the 10th Army on Okinawa, for instance, detail the establishment of hospitals that treated not only American wounded but also vast numbers of Japanese civilians, suffering from malnutrition, dysentery, and war wounds. These were not mere gestures. They were large-scale logistical operations designed to stabilize a chaotic environment and prevent further loss of life. The sight of American doctors and nurses working tirelessly to save Japanese lives, often using equipment and medicines far superior to what was available to the local populace, further eroded the carefully constructed image of the demonic enemy. One poignant aspect of this unexpected interaction was the often unspoken cultural exchange. While formal dialogue was limited, observation was constant. Japanese women, accustomed to a highly structured, patriarchal society and a life of profound scarcity, witnessed American soldiers, often boisterous and informal, yet capable of profound kindness. They observed the easy camaraderie among the GIs, the value placed on individual initiative, even when tempered by military discipline, and the underlying philosophy of a nation that prioritized, at least in its stated ideals, the welfare of its citizens. The concept of abundance was not merely about food. It was about the very ethos of a society that could afford such generosity even to its vanquished foes. The canned peaches, in this broader context, represented more than just a sweet treat. They symbolized a different economic and political order, one that was bewilderingly prosperous and, in its own way, surprisingly benevolent. The transformation in perception among the Japanese women was a micro-reflection of a macro-transformation that would sweep across Japan. The initial terror, born of fierce propaganda and the brutal realities of war, gradually gave way to a grudging acceptance, then to curiosity, and finally, for many, to a profound re-evaluation of their nation's former leadership and ideology. The imperial way, which had promised glory and self-sacrifice, had delivered only destruction and starvation. The demons from across the sea, however, had brought not just defeat, but also a strange, unsettling promise of stability and even prosperity. Many women, who had been prepared to die for the emperor, now found themselves reliant on the generosity of the occupying forces for their very survival. This shift was fundamental, laying the groundwork for Japan's embrace of democracy and its post-war pacifism. It was a testament to the power of lived experience over indoctrinated belief. The American emphasis on individual rights, on civilian well-being, however imperfectly applied in the chaos of war, presented a stark contrast to the totalitarianism they had just escaped. The stories of individual soldiers, like Tommy Henderson and his peaches, were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a larger tapestry of humanitarian effort. Countless accounts from both American servicemen and Japanese civilians attest to the widespread provision of aid. Memoirs of occupation soldiers often describe the initial fear and distrust of the Japanese population, followed by a gradual thawing as food and medical supplies were distributed. Conversely, Japanese civilian testimonies frequently recount the shock of encountering kindness from an enemy they had been taught to despise and fear, often specifically mentioning the distribution of food. These personal narratives, while sometimes anecdotal, paint a consistent picture. The American soldier, often portrayed as a terrifying brute, frequently emerged as a reluctant provider, a dispenser of unexpected mercy. The profound echoes of those first tentative gestures resonated through the decades. What began as a desperate plea for survival in a dark cave transformed into the cautious acceptance of a new reality. The terror, painstakingly unlearned, gave way to a new understanding of the world, one where the clear lines of enemy and ally blurred under the harsh light of shared human experience. This was not a triumph of arms alone, but a subtle victory of empathy, of a universal human impulse to relieve suffering, even in the face of deep-seated animosity. The story of the Japanese women, paralyzed by fear yet gently guided by American soldiers, stands as a testament to the enduring power of compassion in conflict. It speaks to a fundamental truth, that even amidst the furnace of war, where ideologies clash and nations bleed, the simple act of offering a hand, a morsel of food, can plant the seeds of profound transformation. The lingering scent of those syrupy peaches, conjured from memory, becomes a metaphor for the enduring ideals of a democratic society. Not just its military might or economic prowess, but its capacity for humanitarianism, for recognizing the shared dignity of all people. It speaks to a generosity that transcends victory, a belief in abundance that extends beyond national borders. In the shattered landscapes of a defeated nation, these small acts of grace became the bedrock upon which trust was slowly, painfully rebuilt. They whispered of a truth that war often obscures, that true strength lies not just in the power to destroy, but in the will to heal, to nourish, and to respect. The very act of offering, of providing succor to the terrified, became the silent, profound articulation of a future where freedom was not merely a concept, but a lived experience, where abundance was shared, and where the human spirit, however bruised, could ultimately find its way back to hope. This, then, is the enduring legacy of those unexpected encounters, a testament to how the gentlest of gestures can reshape the destiny of a people and the perception of a nation. It is a cinematic reflection on the quiet heroism of humanity in its darkest hour, a narrative woven not in grand battles, but in the soft rustle of leaves, the distant rumble of artillery, and the unexpected sweetness of a canned peach. The profound reverberations of these initial, tentative gestures rippled far beyond the immediate battlefields and refugee camps. They began to dismantle decades of carefully constructed animosity, replacing it with a complex, often bewildering, new reality. For the Japanese women, the shift from fearing utter annihilation to receiving unexpected succor was nothing short of a psychological earthquake. Their deeply ingrained cultural values, which emphasized self-sacrifice and an unwavering loyalty to the emperor, were now confronted by the palpable humanitarianism of the supposed enemy. This wasn't merely about survival. It was about the profound confusion that arose when the architects of their suffering, the gaijin invaders, were simultaneously the providers of their salvation. Many grappled with immense internal conflict, reconciling the vivid, terrifying images of American brutality from their propaganda with the tangible acts of kindness they now experienced daily. This internal struggle became a silent, yet powerful, catalyst for Japan's post-war embrace of pacifism and democracy. Historians would later note that the American approach to civilian populations in Japan, particularly during the occupation, was remarkably progressive for its time, contrasting sharply with the brutality often inflicted by conquering armies throughout history. General MacArthur's directive was clear: win the hearts and minds of the Japanese people. This grand strategic objective was translated into myriad small acts by individual soldiers on the ground. Beyond the initial distribution of food and medical aid, the occupation forces initiated public health campaigns, rebuilt infrastructure, and, crucially, fostered the emergence of democratic institutions. For Japanese women, who had traditionally held a subordinate role in society, the American emphasis on universal suffrage and equality, however imperfectly implemented initially, presented a radical departure from their past. The sight of American women working in military hospitals or administrative roles, interacting with men as relative equals, offered a stark, if sometimes bewildering, glimpse into alternative societal structures. The symbolism of the canned peaches, so readily dismissed as a trivial detail, evolved to encapsulate this broader cultural and ideological exchange. They were a tangible representation of American democratic ideals, not in the abstract, but in the practical, nourishing form of abundant provision. They spoke of an economic system capable of producing such surplus, and a political system that, despite its flaws, was ultimately geared towards the welfare of its citizenry. This stark contrast with the Japanese wartime economy, which had ruthlessly diverted resources from its populace to fuel its war machine, was not lost on the women receiving these gifts. The peaches became a silent educator, a sweet lesson in the tangible benefits of a society founded on different principles. They were a taste of freedom, not just from hunger, but from the oppressive scarcity and rigid control that had defined their lives under militarist rule. The long-term impact of these myriad encounters was perhaps most evident in the upbringing of the next generation. The children who had received candy from GIs, whose wounds had been bandaged by American medics, grew up with a different narrative than their parents had known. They learned English from American soldiers, played baseball with them, and saw them not just as conquerors, but as figures of authority who also brought playgrounds, school supplies, and a sense of ordered peace. The stories passed down by their mothers, though still tinged with the horror of war, increasingly included anecdotes of unexpected benevolence. These experiences fostered a generation of Japanese citizens who, while proud of their heritage, were also uniquely open to Western influences and committed to international cooperation. The peace treaty and the subsequent alliance between Japan and the United States were not solely the result of diplomatic negotiations. They were, in part, built upon the millions of small, personal interactions where fear was gradually replaced by understanding. This profound historical transformation serves as a potent reminder of humanity's enduring capacity for both immense cruelty and surprising compassion. The initial terror of the Japanese women, born of a brutal war and pervasive propaganda, was gradually, painstakingly disarmed by the simple, repeated acts of kindness from their American conquerors. The story of their gentle guidance, of shared peaches and bandaged wounds, transcends the boundaries of nation and conflict. It speaks to a universal truth, that even in the darkest epochs, when humanity seems most fractured, the simple act of recognizing another's vulnerability and responding with empathy can forge bonds stronger than any weapon. The lingering resonance of those sweet, syrupy gifts echoes through history, a quiet testament to the possibility of reconciliation, and a powerful metaphor for the profound, often subtle, ways in which the course of human destiny can be altered, one act of unexpected kindness at a time. It is a narrative that finds its heart in the shared human experience, rising above the din of battle to reveal the enduring hope for understanding. The historical narrative, rich with the ironies of war, often glosses over these granular moments, the subtle shifts in human perception that ultimately reshape national destinies. For the Japanese women, the journey from abject terror to cautious acceptance was a complex tapestry woven from individual encounters, each thread contributing to a seismic cultural realignment. Initially, their fear was a shield, a psychological defense mechanism against the unimaginable horrors they had been taught to expect. Every American soldier was a potential rapist, a murderer, a monstrous embodiment of the enemy. This was not merely abstract belief. It was a visceral, deeply ingrained terror that manifested in physical trembling, averted gazes, and the instinct to flee or hide. The very act of being approached by a uniformed GI was an exercise in overcoming years of psychological conditioning. Yet, the consistent, albeit sometimes clumsy, humanity displayed by many American soldiers proved to be an irresistible force against this ingrained fear. The propaganda had been a monolithic wall, but acts like Tommy Henderson's offer of peaches created cracks. Then came the medical care, the clean water, the simple provision of blankets against the cold nights in makeshift camps. These were not acts of war. They were acts of survival, offered by the supposed enemy. The bewilderment turned into a profound cognitive dissonance. How could such barbarians be capable of such kindness? This question, initially unsettling, slowly began to erode the foundations of their worldview. They observed, they whispered, they debated amongst themselves, and in doing so, they began to forge a new understanding of their conquerors, and by extension, of the world beyond their insular nation. The American military's strategic decision to prioritize civilian welfare was not purely altruistic. It was also a calculated move to stabilize the conquered territories, prevent insurgency, and facilitate a peaceful occupation. However, the impact on the ground transcended strategic calculus. For the women receiving the aid, it was intensely personal. The image of the gaijin began to fragment. Instead of a uniform monstrosity, they saw individual men, some gruff, some gentle, some curious, others stoic. They saw vulnerability in the young faces of many GIs, boys scarcely older than their own sons. This personalization of the enemy was a crucial step in the demilitarization of the Japanese psyche. It allowed for the recognition of shared humanity, a truth obscured by the fog of war and the poison of propaganda. The symbolic value of items like the canned peaches deepened over time. Beyond mere sustenance, they represented the tangible benefits of a different societal model. Japan, under its imperial regime, had promised spiritual purity and racial superiority, but delivered only privation and death. America, the land of apparent endless plenty, offered physical comfort and, subtly, the promise of individual well-being over collective sacrifice. This contrast was particularly stark for the women, whose lives had been defined by scarcity and constant pressure to sacrifice for the state. The ability of the Americans to provide not just for their own troops, but for millions of defeated civilians, was a powerful, unspoken argument for the strength and resilience of a democratic, industrialized society. These acts of generosity were not framed as charity, but as a systematic approach to restoring order and fostering a new, peaceful future. The long shadow of those initial encounters stretched into the post-war era, shaping the very fabric of modern Japan. The women, who had experienced this profound shift firsthand, became the primary educators of the next generation. They taught their children not only the resilience of the Japanese spirit, but also the unexpected lessons of compassion learned from their former enemies. The children of the occupation, playing with discarded American toys, learning English phrases, and consuming American culture, grew up with a dual heritage, deeply Japanese, yet uniquely informed by the American presence. This cultural fusion, often symbolized by the popularity of things like baseball and jazz in post-war Japan, was undergirded by the foundational experiences of their mothers. The peace and prosperity that followed were, in many ways, the harvest of the seeds of trust planted in those desperate moments of surrender and aid. The ultimate testament to this transformation lies in the enduring alliance between Japan and the United States, a relationship that blossomed from the ashes of unimaginable conflict. It is a relationship built not on shared conquest, but on shared values, many of which were quietly forged in those first, tender interactions. The terrifying specter of the American soldier, meticulously crafted by wartime propaganda, was replaced by an image of a partner, a protector, and a key ally in the pursuit of peace and prosperity. The gentle guidance that American soldiers offered to terrified Japanese women was not just an act of wartime humanity. It was a foundational brick in the edifice of a new world order, where former enemies could become steadfast friends. It serves as a powerful cinematic reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, the light of human kindness, however small, can illuminate a path towards a future defined not by retribution, but by rebuilding, reconciliation, and enduring hope. The echoes of those sweet, syrupy peaches, a testament to American generosity and democratic ideals, continue to resonate, a silent, powerful hymn to the redemptive power of empathy. This narrative, born of terror and transformed by grace, ultimately tells a story not just of war, but of humanity's profound capacity for change. It is a story etched in the memories of a generation, passed down through whispers and shared glances, a testament to how the most unexpected acts of kindness can bridge the deepest divides. The sweet, syrupy taste of canned peaches, once a symbol of alien abundance, became an enduring emblem of reconciliation, a reminder that even from the crucible of conflict, a new, more hopeful world can emerge, built on the fragile yet resilient foundations of mutual respect and understanding. It stands as a powerful cinematic reflection on the quiet, yet monumental, shift in human perception, proving that even the most deeply ingrained hatreds can be disarmed by the simple, unwavering offer of a gentle hand.